The shipyard whistles went off at 5:30, echoing across Wallsend and Walker, and within minutes the streets filled with men cycling home from Swan Hunter. Thousands of them, caps on heads, dinner pails in hand, pedaling through the gathering dark towards terraced houses where tea was already on the table. That sound, those whistles marking the end of another shift, told you everything about 1960s Newcastle. This was a city built on steel and sweat. If you remember 1960s Newcastle, hit subscribe. If you lived in Newcastle in the 1960s, either you worked at Swan Hunter or you knew someone who did. The shipbuilding operation at Wallsend stretched along the Tyne, with cranes towering over terraced streets where workers lived practically within sight of the slipways. Close enough that the sound of riveting hammers and welding torches formed the background noise of daily life. Jobs passed through families like heirlooms. Fathers got their sons' apprenticeships. Uncles vouched for nephews, and once you were in, you were set for life as long as you didn't mess about. Apprenticeships started young, sometimes 15 or 16 years old, and lasted 4 years of learning your trade under experienced journeymen who'd been doing the work since before the war. You learned plating, welding, fitting, riveting, whatever skill the yard needed, and by the time you finished, you were a tradesman with a skill that meant something. The yard employed thousands during the 1960s, building everything from cargo vessels to warships, and the pride in that work ran deep because these weren't just ships. They were proof that Newcastle could build anything the world needed. Swan Hunter had launched RMS Mauritania back in 1907, and that legacy hung over everything, a reminder of what Tyneside craftsmanship meant. The unions were strong, the work was steady, and the pay was decent enough to support a family on one wage. The work felt permanent, the wages reliable, and Friday nights meant the pub with men you'd worked alongside all week. Did you or your family work at Swan Hunter? What do you remember about the yards? Last week of June meant the hoppings arrived on Town Moor, and you could see the lorries rolling in days before, massive trailers carrying rides and generator trucks and caravans, setting up Europe's largest travelling funfair on the open moorland just north of the city centre. Barkers shouted from sideshow platforms, voices carrying across the fairground over the mechanical music and the screams from the waltzers and the chair-o-planes spinning overhead. Dancing girls in tassels and sequins stood outside the striptease tents, smiling at passing crowds, while children queued for the ghost train and teenagers showed off on the dodgems. Tom Norman's travelling Palladium show booth drew crowds with its Victorian-style curiosities, and the smell of fried onions and candy floss mixed with diesel fumes from the generators powering everything. Families from across Tyneside poured onto the moor all week, spending money on rides and games, kids carrying goldfish home in plastic bags that always leaked by morning. The fair started in 1882 as a temperance festival to counter race week gambling and drinking, though 60 years later, the irony was lost on nobody. Half the men went straight from the rides to the nearest pub. Shopping meant Northumberland Street on Saturday mornings, and doing it properly meant the whole morning because rushing defeated the purpose. Woolworths anchored the street with its massive frontage and penny sweets counter where children pressed their faces against the glass deciding how to spend threepence, while Farnon's department store spread across multiple buildings knocked together into a maze of higgledy-piggledy rooms where you went up a few steps, then down a few more, navigating through clothing and homewares and furniture sections that seemed to have no logical organization whatsoever. The shop assistants at Farnon sent your payment through pneumatic tubes that whooshed your money up to some central counting room and returned with your change in a satisfying clunk, which fascinated children who'd beg their mothers to buy anything just to watch the tubes work. Individual shops lined the streets around Northumberland Street, each one specializing in exactly one thing: the butcher for meat, the baker for bread, the greengrocer for vegetables, the tobacconist for cigarettes and pipe tobacco. You queued at each one, sometimes 20 minutes for a pound of mince, and nobody complained because everyone else was waiting too. Corner shops appeared every few streets, small places where you could buy milk, bread, cigarettes, sweets, newspapers, basically anything you might need without trekking all the way into town. Children got sent to these shops with notes and a handful of coins to buy 20 cigarettes for their mam or dad, and shopkeepers handed them over without a second glance. Everything got wrapped in brown paper and tied with string because plastic packaging hadn't taken over, and shopping bags meant sturdy canvas or wicker baskets that women carried home loaded with the week's groceries. Supermarkets didn't exist yet, maybe a small co-op. So you bought from individual shops and took your time because shopping meant catching up with people between the butcher and the baker. By the late 1960s, there was talk of American-style shopping centres coming to Newcastle, modern developments that would change everything, though nobody quite knew whether to be excited or worried about what modern actually meant when applied to shopping. The average shipyard worker at Swan Hunter brought home between £12 and £15 a week in the mid-1960s, and a loaf of bread cost 1 shilling 5 pence, while a pint of milk cost 6 pence. A pint of bitter at your local set you back 1 shilling and 6 pence, roughly 7.5 pence, and a packet of 20 cigarettes cost about 3 shillings depending on the brand. Fish and chips for a family of 4 ran you 5 shillings, 25 pence, and would feed everyone until they couldn't move. Council house rent cost £2 or £3 weekly, bus fare into town was 4 pence, and a cinema ticket for the stalls, not the fancy circle seats but the regular ones, came to 2 shillings. Most people didn't own cars. Buses ran regularly and bikes got you everywhere faster anyway, and phone calls meant walking to the red box on the corner since house phones cost more than most families wanted to spend. Coal got delivered by lorry and tipped through the coal hole into your cellar or coal house, and you shoveled it yourself when you needed to keep the fire going because central heating was something only posh people had. Sunday roast required a joint of meat from the butcher, cost about 10 shillings, and fed the family with enough left over to become Monday's cold meat and Tuesday's cottage pie, stretched and reheated until every bit was used. Women didn't work once they married, so a man's wage supported the entire household. One wage bought rent, food, coal, clothes for the kids when they needed them, and maybe a bit left over for the pub on Friday if you were careful. What do you remember prices being in 1960s Newcastle? Drop a comment. Subscribe to see what came next for Newcastle. Friday night after getting paid meant the pub, and depending on which part of the city you lived in, that could mean the Bridge Hotel by the castle, Crown Posada on the quayside, or the Bodega on Westgate Road. Proper boozers where the beer was cheap and the company familiar. Working men's clubs offered even cheaper pints and entertainment on weekends. Comedians and singers performing for crowds of men still in their work clothes. Dominoes clicking on tables and cigarette smoke hanging thick enough to cut with a knife. Darts leagues ran through the winter. Pub football teams competed on Sundays. And rivalries over Newcastle United versus Sunderland could spark debates lasting until closing time, neither side ever conceding an inch. Church bells rang out Sunday mornings from dozens of different buildings scattered across Newcastle: St Mary's, St Peter's, Catholic churches, Methodist chapels, all of them calling people to service, whether from faith or habit, or simply because that's what Sundays meant. Families dressed in their Sunday best, which meant the same suit worn all week, brushed clean and paired with a fresh shirt, and children squirmed in uncomfortable clothes they were required to wear regardless of protests. The roast went into the oven before leaving for church, timed so it would be ready by 1 o'clock, when everyone returned home hungry and ready to eat. Men detoured to the pub for a Sunday lunchtime pint, maybe 2 if they were feeling flush, always careful to be back by dinner time because Sunday dinner was sacred. Not lunch, dinner, the midday meal, served at 1 o'clock sharp with everyone gathered around the table. Roast beef or lamb, roast potatoes, Yorkshire pudding, vegetables boiled soft, gravy made from the meat juices. Pudding afterward meant apple crumble or treacle tart or bread and butter pudding, something heavy and sweet to finish off a heavy meal. Washing up took an hour with everyone helping, plates and pots scrubbed clean and dried and put away before the afternoon properly started. Sunday afternoon meant visiting relatives or having them visit, children in the street while adults drank tea and talked about work, weather, and whoever wasn't there to defend themselves. Sunday tea arrived around 5 o'clock. Sandwiches, cake, more tea, and evening meant the wireless or television, if you were lucky enough to have one. Families gathered in the living room, listening to whatever was being broadcast. Bath night happened Sunday evening for most families, either in a tin bath set up in front of the fire or in a proper bathroom if you were fortunate enough to have one installed. Shops stayed shut, factories stood silent, and nobody worked. Sunday mattered not for church, but for the break it guaranteed. Before Monday started everything again. Walk through Newcastle in the 1960s blindfolded, and you'd know exactly where you were within minutes. Coal smoke poured from every chimney, creating winter mornings thick with yellow smog. Fog mixed with smoke you could barely see through, though the Clean Air Act of 1956 was slowly clearing the worst of it. Down by the Tyne, the air tasted of hot metal and machine oil. The sharp tang of welding torches mixing with the river's own blend of salt water and decades of industry. Saturday market on the quayside offered brief relief. Fresh fruit, vegetables, flowers, but even there the industrial fog lingered. The wind's direction told you what you'd breathe that day. Shipyard metal from the east, coal smoke from the south, breweries from the west. And you learned to read it the way sailors read clouds. By the end of the 1960s, change was everywhere you looked. Talk of modernization filled council meetings and newspaper columns, discussions about slum clearances and new developments and American-style shopping centers that would transform how people lived and worked and spent their money. Television sets in more homes meant fewer evening visits. Where people had once dropped by for hours of tea and talk, they now stayed in watching the telly, 3 channels keeping families in their living rooms rather than out visiting. Swan Hunter was still going strong in the 1960s, still employing thousands, still building ships that mattered, and the nationalization of 1977 or the devastating closures of the 1980s and 90s were impossible to imagine from where they stood. Jobs seemed guaranteed, the yards untouchable. The Newcastle of the 1960s was industrial, working class, proud of its shipyards and its football team, and its ability to build things the world needed. Secure jobs, tight-knit communities, simple pleasures, the hoppings in June, Sunday roast, a pint at your local, a match at St. James's Park when you could afford the ticket. The city that people grew up in would change dramatically in the coming decades, transformed by factory closures and redevelopment nobody asked for. By decade's end, something had already shifted, and those who lived through it felt the change even if they couldn't name it yet. That's 1960s Newcastle. Subscribe for more local history. Comment below with your memories. What do you miss most about Newcastle back then?